Thank you. Now, I want to zoom into the thought of Joseph Ratzinger, both before and after he was Supreme Pontiff, with regard to the Sacred Liturgy today. He published an interesting document on the Church in the Middle East, Ecclesia in Medio Oriente, in which the centrality, the antiquity, and the universality of the liturgy comes into view. He is handling churches of Eastern Rite in this part of the world, so rich in history, the Middle East, which are under his authority. And therefore it is a complex issue, but that very complexity shows the underlying unity. And in looking at his thought, we see the profound issues at work in any discussion of the liturgy which is not polemic. We are handling here something profoundly divine. It's not of human origin, and therefore to make it human is grossly to misunderstand its dynamic. Polemics in this field are the fruit of people who have a human vision of things, and if they're into that, then we leave them to it. We have better things to do while on earth than engage with man when handling the divine, for God wants to be looked at and not man when it is his stage. Here then are some of his thoughts indicating the antiquity, the apostolicity, the Catholicity of all that pertains to the divine liturgy. In the context of the Christian faith, he says, communion is the very life of God, which is communicated in the Holy Spirit through Jesus Christ. It is a gift of God which brings our freedom into play and calls for our response. So do we see here already that the realm of freedom is not that of freedom to create, but freedom to respond to God on the level of nudges being perceived. And therefore the true interaction between man and God in the liturgical sphere is not that of the DJ, but that of the disciple, the adorer, who fades from the sight of others and is free to engage, and in which there can be a divine and therefore almost mystical experience. We're handling here the beyond. We're handling here the frontier region, the threshold. Indeed, we're handling the feet of God, and before those feet we lie prostrate. To get up and say how great I am, directly or indirectly, is to be a thorough nuisance, not only for the people of God, but for one's own soul. We're not great sheikhs, and to think that we are when the liturgy is to misunderstand our game. While it clearly engages Christians by virtue of their shared apostolic faith, it remains no less open to our Jewish, he says, and indeed he goes on, and Muslim brothers and sisters. Now he's saying this in a very wide spectrum of vision, because he's coming here into the relationship of the earth with its maker, and he does see that something does unite all souls across the world who are trying to approach that one God. It is easier to see how there is a lot in common when it comes to our Jewish brethren, because we are sharing elements of their faith and liturgy. Our liturgy is partly Jewish. But with regard to the Muslims, there is a problem, and of course the only important person ever to have had the courage to say anything against the Muslim problem in recent times, over the last 20 years, was actually Pope Benedict. In the lecture at Regensburg on the question of the evolution of the thought of man, he approached the question of what is needed to persuade the reason from a purely philosophical point of view, and quoted a medieval Christian author and authority on the question in indicating that the problem with regard to dialogue over the planet began when reason ceased to be its only point of reference, and when coercion, he meant physical force, took its place, indicating that there was there a turning point in the evolution of thought, and that to do that was to enter into a different realm, that of taking away freedom of consent. A person under torture and under threat is not free, and therefore any consent obtained on the level of the will is not valid. That was the entire thrust of his discourse, and because he dared to quote somebody who was actually talking specifically about the problem in which the Islamic bloc evangelized, already at the origin of its faith, in the time of Muhammad, he was bold enough to create a problem, indicating the lack of capacity of certain cultures to dialogue, and therefore it actually demonstrated the real problem. It demonstrated that precisely we have a problem on the level of civilization. Indeed, Winston Churchill, neutral and balanced as he was, had the courage way back in about the 40s or 50s to make this remark, that Islam was a force which settled upon culture like a blight. In other words, it created a problem on the level of the development of culture. And he did add that Christianity has on its side the fact that it is a religion that favoured science. It had science on its side and it favoured it. Now, this is actually purely human intellectual reasoning. It's nothing polemic, it's just observing the evolution of thought and of culture. That certain patterns of thought lead to certain patterns of behaviour. And to coerce other people in the realm of behaviour and of thought is to behave in a way which is demeaning towards the dignity of human culture and indeed civilization. One cannot regress. And to regress is actually to abdicate over the victories gained over patient centuries of conquest of what reason can do. This is serious because it contains the whole of our life. It concerns us with our dialogue with our brethren within the Catholic faith who might differ on certain minor points. It concerns us in our dialogue with Protestants who are very much towards fidelity towards the gospel as they see it, and therefore we have to respect what they're saying without in any way aggressing them. We look at what they're looking and we see what they're seeing, and we respect and then try to find a common point. The problem is that outside certain cultures, different elements enter in, and if one looks at the way in which dialogue is conducted between certain cultures and others, one sees immediately there is a problem. Certain cultures are unable calmly to dialogue. All they can do is raise the voice and deflect onto other issues. It is an indication immediately that there is something missing on the level of their capacity to reason. So in mentioning this, Pope Benedict is actually very courageous. He puts therefore the wider spectrum in view and says that normally we should be able to find common points of reference with the Islamic bloc. This is something which shows the breadth of vision of Benedict XVI. Now, all that is somewhat of a parenthesis, but it's not indifferent either. We'll see why as we go along. In prayer, we must remember, we are all equal. We are fractions of humanity. And we must be very careful of presumption when it comes to considering ourselves also spiritually superior to others. We have more as regards theological knowledge and revelation, but in the eyes of God, the question of superiority is of a different order. It is of the order of fidelity to the light perceived, and only God can see that. Hence it is that we need to be very careful about brushing aside other believers, whatever actually their faith may be. And so he goes on, and he says, to all those ordered in various ways to the people of God, taking up there the concentric circle effect that we find in Lumen Gentium, which is the dogmatic constitution on the nature of the Church. We see in Lumen Gentium how the fullness of revelation is there in what the Lord instituted. The actual expression used in the teaching of the Church in the Second Vatican Council is this, that the fullness of the Church subsists in the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. The Roman Church in practice has that subsistence. The will of God is perceived therein. It cannot be there without Peter. We must remember that because that is of divine origin. The structure of the Church has to have Peter in the midst. But then the document goes on to describe the way in which the grace of God overflows. And in this concentric effect, it reaches ever wider circumferences, going, of course, within the Christian bloc to others outside its centre, because grace overflows to our brethren, Anglicans, whatever it might be. But then we go beyond those borders. We find our Jewish brethren, who are, as it were, stuck in history, but they're of good faith. Then the Muslim world, they come into it because of the monotheism involved. And then this question of people of goodwill who are trying their best to follow the light they have. In other words, are they obeying their conscience or not? That is kind of important when it comes to the crunch. We're judged on fidelity to the conscience. We don't know the mysterious way in which God is trying at all times to get people before they die, working on the good that they're doing. So we need to have the vision of God. But anyone who gets to heaven gets there because of Calvary. It's never without the precious blood. No one can come to the Father except through me. So that is the bottom line, and that was picked up again by Ratzinger when he was head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, when they published Dominus Jesus, that document which was reminding people that Christ had to be always enthroned as the means of salvation. That was in reference to a certain over-elasticity with regard to theological understanding of how salvation works. Because people are, in a way that we cannot fully understand in this life, if they're of goodwill, brought closer and closer by the nudgings of divine grace to the source of healing and salvation, the precious blood. And how that might be applied, we don't know. But no one will be in heaven who is not also saved by the precious blood. And in that way, also, the salvation of any soul is within the Church. How they become in some way involved with the mystery of salvation, which is the Church itself, which is the sacrament of the salvation of the human race, as defined by Vatican II, we don't know. But anyone who is in heaven is at that stage in the Church, because the Church will continue in the saved in heaven. So we don't know quite how, but it does make sense. What was defined by Boniface VIII way back, extra ecclesia, nulla salus, outside the Church there's no salvation, makes sense on the level of Calvary. It's all through Calvary, and this mystical bonding happens through Calvary. We find those who are saved there, washed in the blood of the Lamb. How, we will see one day. The Catholic Church, he goes on, in the Middle East is aware that she will not be able fully to manifest this communion at the ecumenical and interreligious level unless she has first received it in herself, within each of her churches and among all her members. Now that's important. Among all her members, we need to be people of peace, people who have the vision of Christ, who is on side, as we have there in the teaching of St. Paul, writing to Timothy, who wills the salvation of all mankind. He wants us all, and therefore our will is that of Christ. Please, Lord, save this soul before me, whatever that soul's misery and position. So, what are these? All these members, patriarchs, yes, bishops, priests, religious, consecrated persons and lay persons. Growth by individuals in the life of faith and spiritual renewal within the Catholic Church will lead to the fullness of the life of grace and theosis, divinization. That's very Eastern. He's using it deliberately. The Eastern spirituality is very much based on divinization, theosis. As the East put it, Christ became man that man might become God. Cyril of Alexandria, I believe. In this way, or rather, Athanasius, it would be Athanasius who said that. In this way, the Church's witness will become all the more convincing. So, our business is divinization, that we need to be inhabited, and that in that inhabitation, God is in command of our soul. And therefore, this is the baggage we bring up to us with regard to worship. We are, as it were, when in the house of God, a tabernacle within the tabernacle. The Lord is present within us. He is present around us. We're meeting God objectively, but we already have Him. And therefore, the correct atmosphere that we should have, not only around us, but inside us, is that of the peace of the Trinity. We have to be members in peace. That will have an effect with regard to the way we approach the divine in the liturgy. And also the way that we handle liturgy in our discoursing on the theme. It's not a matter of polemics, the question of prayer. It's far better, actually, if one finds that all one can do in a certain liturgical context, which is dysfunctional, is be so distracted that one is thinking actually about what is going wrong all the time rather than about the Lord Jesus. Then, if possible, the best thing to do is actually choose a celebration where that is not the case. Because if all one's precious time in the liturgy is spent on concentrating on what is taking us away from God, with regard to the centre of attention, I would suggest that God probably would find a better place for us to spend that precious time, even if it does mean a bit of travelling, because it's important that in that time that we're engaging with our God, we're actually engaging with our God and not with another problem. So, Pope Benedict goes on to the pristine notion of liturgy, which is that of the early church. What do we find there? The example of the first community in Jerusalem can serve as a model for renewing the present Christian community and making it a place of communion for witness. The Acts of the Apostles, he says, give us a simple yet touching early description of this community born on the day of Pentecost, a company of believers who were of one heart and soul. From the beginning, there was a fundamental connection between faith in Jesus and ecclesial communion, as becomes clear from the two interchangeable expressions, one heart and soul. Communion is not the result of our own human efforts. It comes about, above all else, by the power of the Holy Spirit, who creates in us the faith which works through love. He's referring there to Galatians chapter 5. So he's going back to the Acts of the Apostles, as we see. And what do we find there? In the Acts, we find the unity of believers. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship. This word fellowship is a great word in English. To the breaking of the bread and the prayers. The notion of fellowship, communion, koinonia, is very profound in all that we have to do in the realm of the liturgy. If it is not a place of koinonia, of fellowship, of communion, of oneness, it is dysfunctional. We therefore must be very careful never to be a source of being dysfunctional for anyone in the realm of the things of God. There are ways and means of doing things in a peaceful way which don't hurt. God is not honoured by wounded souls. in the course of the liturgy. He hurts in them. So this verse 2:42 of Acts is very important. The unity of believers was thus nourished by the teaching of the apostles. Now we have those two parallels straight away. Teaching and the breaking of bread. They have to be both there. We notice actually that Paul at one stage talked on until midnight, and we know the consequences. But it meant that they were getting a lot of teaching. And then at dawn he broke bread. So, to which they responded with unanimous faith by fraternal communion, by the breaking of the bread, and by prayer, both personal and communal. It was on these four pillars that communion and witness were based within the first community of believers. And he says, "May the Church, which has lived uninterruptedly in the Middle East from apostolic times to our own day, find in the example of that community the resources needed to keep fresh the memory and the apostolic vitality of her origins." Now we've had in recent times the case of Damascus. The house where Ananias lived, the one who was sent to Saul to lay hands upon him that he might receive his sight and that he might be baptized, that house was still standing, at least until these last very unpleasant scenes in Syria. And it was, I believe, in that house, or if not, just opposite it, I think actually it was the house itself, that Myrna was living, and she, in the early 80s, was given these very strange phenomena. It started with the icons oozing and doing things, miracles, and then she started to have these gifts, stigmata and all the rest of it, and then these messages. And of course the Vatican sat up because she was under Rome, even though she was under an Eastern Rite. But what was coming through was the way in which each time that the East of the West, the Easter date of the West coincided with that of the East, that is every 5 years or so, the phenomena increased very much. They became quite spectacular. And what was coming quite obvious was that the Lord was getting a message through, and in fact this was the message, and she was getting through also to the Vatican with this, that the Lord was wanting to heal this division with regard to the East and the West. And that this question of having two Easters was not his doing, it was man's doing, and he wanted that healed. And of course we're having these negotiations going on right now. In fact, this business of in the East themselves trying to get the Eastern churches amongst themselves to agree to dialogue with Rome. What's been going on in Cyprus, all this huge, what they call the Great Holy Synod, a council, they're trying to make unity amongst themselves and also to have unity with regard to their common front, with regard to what happens with Rome, because Rome is trying to get this sorted. We know that Benedict XVI, before abdicating, drew up a document trying to get this to happen, giving some kind of model which would make it happen theologically and pastorally, because he knew how to do it because of all the issues. So it's been left now in the hands of the East to a large extent. So we do know that recently the present Pope Francis had a 2 hours talk with the Patriarch of Moscow, and even though the Patriarch of Moscow is not actually the first among equals in the East, it would theoretically be the Patriarch of Constantinople for historic reasons. He is nevertheless, because of what's happened in history, that of the most powerful Eastern Church, because of the Eastern Bloc being hugely there where Istanbul is, in the hands of Muslims, it's actually very small and therefore politically not important, whereas it's very important what goes on in Moscow. And we actually see Putin there in church at big celebrations. It's very interesting how they're still very much aware of the link between the certain states, which is an important thing there, what goes on in the East there. Therefore, that's why we see that Moscow isn't too keen to be seen to be inferior to Istanbul. However, all that to say that this is important, that actually Pope Benedict had 2 hours private chat with the most important of the Eastern patriarchs a few months ago. So these are signals being sent out discreetly. And so we need to be aware what the Holy Spirit is trying to do, because we need to be aware of our roots and of the wider vision of God. He never meant this split between East and West. And we have to look over our soldiers always to be aware of where we're coming from and sometimes what we've actually lost, because they're not in a hurry to lose things. They think in terms of centuries over there. Now, he goes on. precisely in this realm of the origins, and what is our common origin. He wants, therefore, to keep fresh the memory and the apostolic vitality of the origins. So, he is aware of his own position. He does say this, like my predecessors in the See of Peter, I wish here to state once more my desire to ensure that the rites of the Eastern churches, as the patrimony of the whole Church of Christ, in which shines forth tradition coming down from the apostles to the fathers, and which in its variety affirms the divine unity of the Catholic faith, are observed and promoted conscientiously. I likewise assure my Latin brothers and sisters of my affection and my concern for their needs and necessities in accordance with the commandment of charity which presides over all and the norms of law. He's talking there to those in these Eastern countries who are of Western rite, Latin rite. We see it in Jerusalem, that when we go there to celebrate in Palestine, in the area of Jerusalem, all that area there, the Holy Land, we name the bishop, the patriarch of Jerusalem, who's the Latin patriarch. In our case, it's Fuad. Of course, historically, there would have been only one patriarch right back. It would have been the successor of James, the apostle, whose feast it was yesterday. However, the Armenians very early on had a patriarch, and so that's an ancient family as well. We must respect them because Aram is Syria, and Aramaic was the language the Lord used, and there's a very ancient liturgy there, and the antiquity of these rites is something that stands out. It is, however, interesting that in Bethlehem, for instance, the status quo is this, that the only rites who are allowed to celebrate in the grotto where the Lord was born are the Latin rite. It happens every day, but also solemnly every Thursday at dawn, a fully sung Latin Mass, and the Greek church. They have their own altars. That is, there are two altars down there. One is the one where the Lord was actually born, and the other one is where he was actually laid, Presepium. And we have that latter one. But there's only a small grotto anyway, underground. Occasionally, very occasionally, maybe once or twice a year, possibly 3 times, the Armenians also are allowed to celebrate. But it shows the antiquity and the understanding from the earliest times that the two central points are the East and the West as understood by the traditions coming down from the beginning. We must remember that the Latin was a second stage. The language of the early church was Greek. The New Testament is written in Greek. Greek was the language of communication in the Mediterranean basin. This was the Koine, the common Greek. It was a more elastic version than what we would study in university. It was easily understood, quite flexible, and it was a language spoken by the slaves, even in Rome. Therefore, in Rome, it was hugely used. But what happened was, when Christianity reached Rome, very quickly, to have authentic liturgy, they allowed it to be translated into the language, official language of Rome, which was Latin. And because of the close link between Latin and Carthage, Carthage also took on the Latin. And it was in Carthage that the language of the church evolved in the realm of theology quite early on. We had great writers there, Cyril, and people, Clement, not Cyril, Clement of Alexandria, and these people were writing in languages which were giving a theological language, Tertullian also. These were writing in a language which was very good Latin and which was to remain, giving a corpus. And then, of course, the great Augustine also writing in that area of North Africa, because the language there of culture in North Africa was Latin. And that actually would have carried on had it not been, unfortunately, for... it was Cyprian, that's right, what I meant, Cyprian, not... Clement was writing in Greek, I believe, and it was Cyprian who was writing in Latin in Carthage. But it was the Islamic bloc which unfortunately took over that, and it was made possible by the fact that the weakening of Christianity in North Africa had taken place through internal division, notably the Donatist heresy. The Donatist heresy led to something which was unfortunately not necessary, because they had the sacraments, but they were actually in schism and in heresy, and it was actually going off. But they made it difficult then to resist the Islamic bloc when it came in the 600s, because they were divided amongst themselves, which largely explains the way in which very quickly Islam had an effect on North Africa. So that's just a little parenthesis to explain how we lost that huge patrimony in a short time in North Africa, which would have been very Catholic, with a great dignity about it, with great writers like Augustine on toe. So we have here what is unfortunately the situation as we have it. The Latin was the language of the whole Western bloc, which then of course came further and further west. It was the language taken on obviously by areas like Spain, the whole of Italy, France as well, which took on forms of Latin, because French and Spanish, Portuguese are based on the Latin, as far actually as Romania, which traditionally would be called the garden of Our Lady, the Garden of Mary. That's the way they called Romania out there. It was something very Marian, but it was the old Dacia of the Roman times, and they also had the use of Latin, and that has become the modern Romania, which is still, although it doesn't look like that, it is actually still based on Latin, very Slavonic in tone, but it's actually based on Latin, which is not the case of languages that go further away. Hungarian and so on, they have different origin, and so it goes on to the Slavic countries. However, all that to say that these were taking on the Latin, and of course we did too, because from Rome we had missionaries coming further and further west. They're coming into Britain, coming into Wales, and of course then the link between the extreme west, Ireland, and this main Latin bloc does come through, because Patrick also was writing in Latin. He was formed at places like Les Reims on the continent. He was in contact with the main current there, and he was for a while on this monastic island of Les Reims in the Mediterranean, where people like Cassian had been, and there's a great contact there with the monastic world, but he was bringing on also Roman baggage with him. Now, we must remember also that when it came to the Romanization somewhat of the Christianity coming into Britain, Pope Gregory did send books, liturgical books, and things, codices, with these missionaries that he himself was sending. Gregory the Great was sending Augustine and these 40 monks. They landed in 597, but they were coming with things from Rome, which was giving a Roman structure to the church and also a Latin liturgy. So we must remember the antiquity of this, the whole Western bloc coming this with the Latin, which had the advantage of standardizing things, because the great advantage is that when we're using the same prayers, the same theological language, it avoids heresy. And that was kind of important, because it did maintain orthodoxy and the same standard rite all over the place. The East went very early on into diversification of languages. We have the apostles, Cyril and Methodius, working on the very languages themselves, creating an alphabet. We have the present Russian use of the Cyrillic alphabet in the old Slavonic rites. We see here that they are using an alphabet which was created explicitly by Cyril and Methodius so as to make possible the writing of what was out there. But then what happened was, as it does often happen, that the sanctity of the words that they had used there in the first generations of evangelization made such an impression that they kept them, and therefore they were fossilized, and therefore the old languages of liturgy remained what they were at the moment of evangelization. It's actually what happened in the West as well, because the Latin was the language of origin, and they remained that way until the Second Vatican Council. The venerability of the language itself. So we have certain blocks in the East. They went into the language of the country, they were evangelizing, but then it stayed at that point, and actually to this day, interestingly enough, in Greece, in church in Greece, they still use the Greek of origin. And interestingly enough, the Greek has evolved less than the Italian. from classical Greek. If one compares present Italian with classical Latin, there is more of an evolution, less continuity. If one compares modern Greek with ancient Greek, if one makes adjustment with regard to pronunciation, as one does with Latin going into Italian, because the halfway house that we have in church with the Italian pronunciation of ancient Latin, then we see what's going on. But the actual Greek, once one's got used to the Greek pronunciation of modern Greek, then it's actually pretty close. It's actually pretty close compared with the Italian to what they had. And so, even now, the people do understand quite well the singing, the chanting of the epistle and gospel in the original Greek, because they have the present pronunciation of it, modern Greek. And even now, if one reads modern Greek, knowing ancient Greek, one can understand quite a lot of what's going on, because it hasn't evolved quite as much as I say, Italian. Having said that, the evolution of Latin too is not indifferent. We have a living language until these most recent years now, because we can actually see how in the Middle Ages Latin is still a living language, and the structure of the Church Latin, the written language, is actually coming close to modern Romance languages, with new structures coming in which are more elastic. It's still Latin, however, and it's got the church pronunciation, which is then that of the present Italian. To be explicit, Caeli is what we say now for heavens and so on. It's actually in the Latin of Cicero, it would be Caeli or Coeli. So on it goes. But it's therefore the church pronunciation going on. What am I saying? Just to be aware that we are only one family in the West of all the rich plethora of liturgical families and languages that are of ancient antiquity and origin. So it's important to be aware of all this and not to in some way think that we're the only ones on the planet. I would just like to pause for a minute and come back to it, because I want to attack one specific issue in the second part of this talk. So we'll come back in a few minutes after a short pause. So, I would like to go into a point that Joseph Ratzinger makes shortly, and very shortly, before actually he becomes Pope Benedict. It's in 2004. He is writing the preface of an important historical study on the organic development of the liturgy, written by Alcuin Reid, a Benedictine, and he is adding fuel to his own conflagration, because he is actually keen on getting the point across that liturgy is a living animal and not the product of a factory. So he puts it this way. Referring to Alcuin Reid's own study, he says this: the author then agrees with the Catechism of the Catholic Church in emphasizing that, now here we have a quotation, even the supreme authority in the Church may not change the liturgy arbitrarily, but only in the obedience of faith and with religious respect for the mystery of the liturgy. That's in number 1125 of the Catechism. So he goes on, as subsidiary criteria, we then encounter the legitimacy of local traditions and the concern for pastoral effectiveness. Now he goes here into a personal excursus, which is Benedict coming to the fore, and he has an axe to grind, and he grinds it well. Actually, he writes with more freedom before he's Pope. From my own personal point of view, he says, I should like to give further particular emphasis to some of the criteria for liturgical renewal, thus briefly indicated. I will begin with those last two main criteria. It seems to me most important that the Catechism in mentioning the limitation of the powers of the supreme authority in the Church with regard to reform, recalls to mind what is the essence of the primacy as outlined by the First and Second Vatican Councils. The Pope is not an absolute monarch whose will is law. Rather, he is the guardian of the authentic tradition and thereby the premier guarantor of obedience. He cannot do as he likes, and he is thereby able to oppose those people who, for their part, want to do whatever comes into their head. His rule is not that of arbitrary power, but that of obedience in faith. That is why, with respect to the liturgy, he has the task of a gardener, he says. That's interesting. He has the task of a gardener, not that of a technician who builds new machines and throws the old ones on the junk pile. That's Ratzinger at his best, almost tongue-in-cheek. He goes on. The rite, he puts that in inverted commas, the rite, that form of celebration and prayer which has ripened in the faith and the life of the Church, is a condensed form of living tradition in which the sphere using that rite expresses the whole of its faith and its prayer. And thus, at the same time, the fellowship of generations, one with another, becomes something we can experience. Fellowship with the people who pray before us and after us. Thus, the rite is something of benefit that is given to the Church, a living form of paradosis, the handing on of tradition. Para is onwards, and don, the root of domi, dosis, that's all the root of giving. One hands on, it's tradition basically. In fact, one could translate it deposit. Paul, writing to Timothy, says, guard the deposit. Paradosin. He does make this one point also, which I would like to come to a conclusion with, because it's kind of important. It is important, he says, in this connection to interpret the substantial continuity correctly. Now, what's the bit that goes on? He tries to go into it like this. He points out the danger of a neo-scholastic mentality. Now, the scholastics were those, like Thomas Aquinas, who used Aristotelian philosophy to give us instruments to do philosophy and theology with. In that dialogue, we have the teaching of the matter and form, the substance and accidents. And with regard to matter and form, one can say that the matter of the Eucharist would be the bread and wine, and the form would be the words of institution, that is the consecration, received from the earliest times. And then he points out that there's a danger that those who are wanting a free-for-all in discontinuity with the past, an explosion rather than the hermeneutic of continuity, would want to use that principle to argue that what we have received is the matter and form as we have it in the gospel, bread and wine, and the words of consecration, and the rest is negotiable. Well, he points out that is catastrophic, and it's come in. He is pointing out that there is also a wider, sacred, and divinely guaranteed and protected element of matter and form coming down. That what we have is not just clobber. It's actually the Holy Spirit breathing, guiding, making to grow gently, generation after generation, what is naturally contained therein. He has given us a language. As in human love, there is a language and it's delicate. So too, in divine love and encounter, there is a language, and it's delicate, and it's Spirit-guided. And what's happened in our time is that people not guided by the Spirit of God are not delicate, and they bring in their own thing. "Oh Lord, how great I am, and I will celebrate myself well. Who cares what I'm doing? I am having a good time. And to prove it, I'll have a round of applause at the end." And they all had a great time and went home happy. Where was Jesus Christ? Now, I just want to finish with a quote from something that I wrote after an experience. When I was a student, I had a friend who was in the same class as I was, and he was a man of God, an Eastern Rite monk, Maronite, and he was somebody who was before me already a priest, but we defended our doctoral thesis one day after the other in the same aula. Actually, the same aula as John Paul II would have, because they all had the same place. They all had to go to the same place where there was an urn, and the votes were given then in this urn, black and white pebbles. So anyway, that's just a parenthesis that I knew him. He was a lovely man, a man of God, but he wanted me to be present at the worship they had in his monastery in Rome. So I went, and I wrote this under emotion afterwards. I'll leave it with you. O world apart, the art of being hid within a cloud so bright that light alone is seen by the inward eye. This 'tis that bid the three that climbed that ridge and heard the unknown not stay or utter aught of what no man had hitherto been shown. This was the word that bade all words not be, for listening can be but in holding well a tremble heard. O Tabor, here I climb again that place that on thy feast I walked. Here again the incense sweet that drugged a magic space hath dazed the memory's cells with quiet pain of wanting much, of wanting such a God as none did long forego, that hither trod. So, in a cloud of incense, I'll leave you. Stay there and enjoy your God.